I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the land on which we gather today, the Wangal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. Can I also acknowledge our federal member for Reid, Sally Situ, Mayor of Burwood, Mr John Faker, Monsignor Gregory Flynn, and distinguished guests. I also want to honour the veterans among us, those who have served and the families who have borne that service with strength, love and grace. As patron of the Burwood Sandakan Memorial Committee, it is a profound honour to stand with you in this sacred place of memory, here in the heart of our diverse, generous community. 80 years ago, in the death jungles of Borneo, a tragedy unfolded that still echoes through our national story. Sandakan remains the worst atrocity suffered by Australians during war. More than 2,400 Australian and British prisoners of war captured in Singapore were held at Sandakan. Their task? To build an airfield for their captors. They worked under a sky that offered no mercy, on ground that became a graveyard for hope. They faced starvation, disease, and cruelty that defied belief. When the airfield was bombed and no longer usable, the prisoners were no longer seen as human beings. And so they were marched 260 kilometres inland through jungle and mountain to a place called Ranau. They marched barefoot through mud with swollen legs and starving bodies. Some collapsed, others carried their mates. Those who fell behind were shot or bayoneted, their bodies left unburied. Only 6 survived. These weren't anonymous soldiers. They were brothers and sons, school teachers and shearers, mechanics and milkmen. Some were no older than the students who join us here today. 23 of them came from right here, from Burwood. They belonged to us. What they endured wasn't the chaos of combat. It was the slow grind of cruelty, the cold deliberateness of evil. And yet, even there, they held fast to their humanity. They shared food, passed water, whispered jokes, sang songs, offered kindness in a world of horror. One survivor, Keith Botterill, was thrown into a cage just 5 feet high, 40 days, 7 days without food, beaten daily. And still, he said, they beat me bodily, but they never broke my nerve or my heart. That's what we remember today. Not just how they died, but how they lived. Not just the pain, but the principles they held on to. Because in Sandakan, these men showed us something enduring, something profoundly Australian. They showed us that courage is not about conquest, but care. That mateship is not found in slogans, but in sacrifice. And that even in the most inhumane conditions, the human heart can still choose kindness. It's easy sometimes to look away from the harder chapters of our history, to focus on the uniforms, the parades, the victories. But what happened at Sandakan wasn't glorious. It wasn't fair. It wasn't just. It was brutal, and it was evil. And that is exactly why we must remember it. We remember Private Robert Bob Shipsides from the 2nd 29th Battalion. His mother kept the light on in his room every night, waiting for a son who would never return. Her hope, undimmed by time, speaks to the grief borne by families across Australia, grief that never truly fades. We remember the local Sabaeans who, at great risk to themselves, fed our prisoners and offered small acts of grace. We remember Sandakan today because remembrance gives meaning to pain and truth gives dignity to sacrifice. Sandakan reminds us that our history is not a straight line. It's not always clean. but it is shared. Here in Burwood, one of the most culturally rich and diverse communities in Australia, these stories of war and loss are not distant echoes. They live in the memories of so many who call this place home. Families who fled the ash of war in Vietnam, the ruins of Syria, the partitioned towns of South Asia, or the quiet silences left by conflict in Europe and East Africa. My own family carries such a story. My parents were born in 1940s China during the brutal Japanese occupation. Before the war, my grandfather had studied in Tokyo as an exchange student. He lived with a Japanese family who he adored and who adored him. In 1942, as the Imperial Japanese Army unit advanced towards his village, my grandfather took my 2-year-old mother by the hand and walked straight up to the commander. A bayonet was held at his throat. Speaking in fluent Japanese, he told the officer about his studies, about his love and respect for the people who had once welcomed him into their home. The commander listened, and then he gave the order. The village was not to be harmed. That moment has stayed with my family for generations. And here in Burwood, in every language spoken on our streets, there are stories like these. Stories of suffering, yes, but also of grace, of courage, and of hope. That's why Sandakan speaks to us, not because it is easy to remember, but because it demands that we do so together with open hearts and a shared purpose. And let me say this, especially to the young people here with us today. This is your history too. It is not something dusty and distant. It is the reason we live in peace. It is the reason you walk free. You carry their story now. And remembrance is not just about looking back. It is about asking ourselves, who are we now because of what they endured? Do we carry their courage in how we live? Do we carry their humility in how we live, in how we lead? And do we carry their love of country, not in flag waving or slogans, but in how we show up for one another, especially in times of hardship? And do we understand that the freedom we enjoy came at a terrible cost, and that every generation has a duty to protect it, value it, and live our lives that honour those who never came home? And as we stand here in remembrance at this moment in history, we cannot ignore the sorrow and the anguish carried quietly by many among us. In other corners of the world, the cries of the innocent still go unheard, the lives of children and families shattered by the machinery of war. These moments remind us that history does not sleep. It waits, watching what we choose to learn. The legacy of Sandakan is not just a lesson in loss, but a summons to conscience, to turn away from cruelty, to resist the drift towards hatred, and to keep lit the fragile, flickering hope of peace. Not peace as rhetoric, but peace as the daily, difficult work of empathy and restraint. Prime Minister Paul Keating once said, "There was no glory in the way these men died, but perhaps there can be in their memory." That's our task now, to ensure that Sandakan is not just remembered, but understood. To recognise that these men did not die in vain. They died for a country they believed in, a country they loved, a country that through remembrance can be made more honest, more compassionate, more free. Let us be worthy of that promise, because the past is not just behind us, it lives in us, and through us it shapes the future, lest we forget.